Welcome to Law and Society. Please subscribe. Today we're going to talk about a bunch of things, from voting to a little bit about USAID, about the health and human services, about immigrants and students, international students. We're also going to, the sources that I gathered today come from all the way from Kyle Cheney of Political Reporting to Reuters, to a personal story that I heard from my father that I think is somewhat relevant in understanding what argument Donald Trump has in favor of such drastic and irresponsible cuts to the USAID program. So firstly, I would like to report and re-report again to you and remind you that the voting election executive order that Donald Trump proclaimed is actually null and void. It is not worth the paper it is written on. Here is why. The law of the land is the Constitution and what the Constitution says. The law of the land is also what Congress enacts and then a president signs into law. When those two exist, and then comes an executive order that directly contravenes it, like in this executive order for voting, proof of citizenship, and also doing away with mail-in voting. This executive order actually hits directly Article 1 of the Constitution that gives the power of elections, of how to manage elections and how to conduct elections, to the states and then a backstop to Congress. And it is also it also sort of goes in a side way to undermine the Electoral Count Act, because if you are trying to manage how state elections are going to be held through an executive order, you're also going against how the electoral counts are going to be gathered and how they will be counted. So those two, the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act, they both are like stone walls against which Donald Trump's executive order will fall and shatter. And I want you to know that, but I also want you to call your state secretaries of state to remind them that Donald Trump does not have the authority over elections. Only states and Congress does. And if they have anything to say, if they're Republican, if they have anything to say, you should say that, do you as the Secretary of State want to give away my state's authority to conduct elections how it sees fit by way of state legislature? You're going to deprive my state and me as a citizen of that state of that right by adhering to this executive order that clearly contravenes states' rights, it contravenes the Constitution and acts of Congress. Okay, enough time given to that. But remember that. As I was reading through the news, a lot of things came up. There's been a 70% decrease in Canadian visits to the United States since Donald Trump began his wanting to make Canada the 51st state. You can see how Canada has taken this very seriously, and Canadians there's going to be a backlash, and that when the tariffs hit, if Donald Trump follows through, is going to increase the cost of everything from the price of beer to the price of housing to the price of cars. And, when that happens, we're going to be in the throes of a recession an economic crisis that we're not going to know how to grapple with, especially when you see them getting ready to undermine Social Security, because Donald Trump cannot shut Social Security down without Congress, nor the Education Department, nor any of the other fundings. And that's why these are going to court. Now, in this reading and this going and this gutting of our government infrastructure and our influence around the world, Reuters reported that the United States had paused contribution to the World Trade Organization. I mean, what could go wrong, right? You're starting a trade war, so why would you want to be part of an organization that deals with trade? Because you're going to disorganize the trade all around the world. So it makes sense in a way. And then you have this huge news coming from the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Bobby Jr., who has announced that he's cutting an additional 10,000 jobs, bringing it to 20,000 jobs that are going to be cut from the Department of Health and Human Services. How is that going to affect the CDC? How is that going to affect the FDA? How that's going to affect other health and human services? I believe that, Health and Human Services also has a part to play in providing the services for more than just research or CDC or FDA. I can't think of exactly what. But what I can report is that while there's been all of these cuts, a man named Richard Gere, who has long been an anti-vaxxer, has been hired to do research on the connection between vaccines and autism. So being on the spectrum, so to speak. And at the same time, we are seeing when state health services are being cut, including not giving states grants for infectious diseases and addiction services. Infectious diseases range anywhere from tuberculosis to HIV. So you kind of to hepatitis, to all sorts of infectious diseases that you can think of, that through contagion, some sort of contact, they're not granting states the grants anymore. So state has to come up with the money. I would be very interested in telling the states to just go ahead and stop paying federal taxes altogether, because you're going to have to deal with the fallout from all these withdrawals. So that talk about the health and human services, it's much bigger than just what I said. But I mean, it is definitely much bigger because there are 20,000 people who are going to be out of a job because there are these cuts being made in a blanketed manner. I'm sure that they're going to be litigated. I'm sure a lot of them will have their jobs restored. But the pain and anguish and the trauma caused by this is going to last for generations. When you have people like Joe Rogan, who goes on his podcast with millions and millions of young men subscribers, listening to him being a skeptic of the polio vaccine, you see that there's an emergency because there's a disinformation war also going on. I've seen people who have had polio with how their body dysmorphs by polio, how life becomes difficult by polio. You live in places where polio and measles were almost eradicated, and now you have an outbreak of measles in various states. Many of them can be linked back to the outbreak that started in Texas. What is the CDC going to do about it? What is the Department of Health and Human Services going to do about it? Well, what we know Bobby Jr. is going to do about it is say, yeah, vaccines are available, and so is cod liver oil and vitamin A. That's not how you message something when there is an ongoing outbreak of a preventable infectious disease that is extremely contagious. So now, from that Health and Human Services, we turn to international students and immigration. We've already seen what Donald Trump's administration has done with the Venezuelan migrants, many of whom are asylum seekers, many of whom who were waiting for their dates for asylum, many of whom are not part of any gang, some of whom are gay. And they've picked him up and without procedure shipped him to El Salvador, to a prison, to a gulag, where they are packed in like sardines in a can, and you have Kristi Noem standing in front talking about, this is what's going to happen if you're going to come to the United States. But that's one trauma campaign. The other trauma campaign is that Donald Trump is sending mass enforcement officers to arrest students from universities who may have at some point had dissenting political views that they voiced. People like Rumeysa Ozturk, who is a Tufts University grad student with legal status without a criminal charge. And you know what? The Marco Rubio's response is their visas have been revoked. When you come to America and cause a ruckus, we're going to kick you out. So with that, Marco Rubio is also kicking out our First Amendment rights. Don't ever forget that. You think it's going to end with that? Well, federal immigration agents have detained a University of Alabama doctoral student who is a citizen of Iran, according to the school's and ICE's records. These are students, and these universities need to protect these students and their right to free speech. Because if it goes away, the right to free speech and freedom of assembly and peaceful protest goes away for them who are coming to America to learn not just how to have the foremost education, but also to speak their minds. This will only weaken their resolve and will take away international students coming to America to learn to be free. It's an attack on American education. It's an attack on American immigration policy. It's an attack on education. It's an attack on global partnerships. It's an attack on the rule of law because they're being held and detained without due process of law. Because, wait for it, they haven't broken any law yet. With that, let me tell you this legal updates really quickly. And this comes from Kyle Cheney of Politico. So we're waiting for what happens with the preliminary injunction hearing in the White House's efforts of keeping Associated Press from the press pool. I wish every press agency, every media group would boycott Donald Trump and his administration until AP is returned its credentials and allowed to be part of the press pool. There is going to be an emergency hearing about the global media cuts to Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, which is part of the Voice of America executive order cut. Then you have Judge Boasberg, who happened by chance to also get the Signal scandal lawsuit by American Oversight, along with the lawsuit of the immigrants to Venezuela, which is a violation of the Alien Enemies Act, because the Alien Enemies Act is not properly applicable in this situation, because this is not a war, this is migration. So Judge Boasberg has ordered the preservation of the signal chats messages. I think they may already have been wiped, but I think maybe not. I think the timing that they were supposed to be deleted was, I don't know, I don't remember exactly what the time frame was, but with the preservation of this records order, we're going to see whether these people comply with that order or not. And whether they comply, whether J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, Mike Waltz, and and Mike Waltz, these people, and Stephen Miller also, if these people even comply with the order, if they're busy deleting, and Tulsi Gabbard busy deleting the whole conversation, that's not going to work, because Jeffrey Goldberg has already published what was said, and he has the record on his phone as well. So there was also a ruling this evening that was blocked in Seattle and stayed by the DC Circuit. Hold on one second. Yeah. A Seattle judge regarding the military transgender ban blocked it, and the DC Circuit has also stayed a case about stayed the ban itself by because there's going to be hearing on it. So there's also going to be a potential appeal of the ruling by the DC Circuit about the Alien Enemies Act to uphold the temporary restraining order. So it depends on whether Donald Trump will want the full DC Circuit Court to sit and hear the case, or whether he'll want to go to SCOTUS directly. And what other legal news? And then we have the filing on the removal of the Turkish student Rumeysa Öztürk, and she was moved to Louisiana again. Why the hell? Probably because they want a favorable forum for any kind of legal matters that could be raised. But no, I don't think so, because you have just now taken them from one jurisdiction to another. It falls under it's a federal matter. The federal court in the jurisdiction where she is the resident will call her back, and she will have to be returned to her location where she is a student. I mean, what is the pretext for removing her visa? That she had something to say? So are we assaulting her First Amendment rights? Does a legal student, a legal resident under a legal visa of this country not have the right to speak their minds? Are we that far gone? The last story I want to tell you is more of a personal story. But I also want to remind you this. This is a personal story. And it kind of made me think about the government is bloated. Yes, there's waste. But the way that the hatchet job that Donald Trump and Elon Musk has done, especially with the USAID, is quite abhorrent. So I was talking to my dad about this. And my dad is, he's fairly well informed, but I think if it came to voting, he can, because he's an Indian citizen. I'm one of those half and half here, half there people. So he was like, well, my friend in Bangladesh, because my father is a refugee from Bangladesh from before the division of Bangladesh from Pakistan all of that in the 70s happened. So I'm an immigrant and also son of a refugee. And so it's funny that we get these points of references. But anyway, my father's friend manages a nonprofit organization in Bangladesh that deals with lower income group people and a lot of Rohingya people, and they used to get part of USAID funds. And as I started talking about USAID, he said, yes, well, now it's all stopped. I was like, yes, now it's all stopped. But he's like, before it wasn't coming to the right people. I'm like, what do you mean by that? He said, well, my friend is the one who manages the NGO and the cause for which USAID gave that organization the money. But the way that they gave the money, they gave it to a point person, so to speak, a middleman, who then took a 25% commission cut from the money that the USAID gave them, and then giving 75% to the organization that my father's friend manages. So that's a personal story where you can see that it is not by intention, but by the nature of corruption that USAID ends up giving at least this entity less money than it intends to. But the solution to that is not stopping aid completely, right? The solution to that the problem here would be to cut out the middleman so you can save the 25% that's going to corruption. And that would require USAID to have a functioning body and not be consolidated into the State Department. So we know that's not going to happen, and that aid is probably not going to come back because they're not going to let aid go to places where you need infectious disease to be stopped. You know, these people in poor countries who don't have vaccines, there's going to be a global shutdown of providing aid to those organizations that give these vaccines to kids in poor parts of the world. So that they're keeping the HIV program alive. They're keeping, I think, hopefully the Ebola program alive. But Elon Musk called it the Ebola something to the effect of Ebola proliferation agency or something. He undermines the work that's being done. And that's why all of USAID is gone. And that was a personal story that gave me perspective on the half-truth upon which Donald Trump can reason why he stopped USAID. But that doesn't solve the problem, nor does it keep our diplomacy up in these parts of the world. It creates a void where China walks in with quid pro quos instead of Americans walking with a helping hand and for development. And, the propaganda about the news is that USAID was giving the Indian opposition money for NGOs. But the Indian political opposition was not using that money for the non-governmental organizations, the non-profits, that they have been charged with overseeing. And that's why the opposition, Rahul Gandhi, the Congress Party, was the point person for that USAID disbursement. But that corruption, apparently, according to my father, is far more corrupt than what happened in Bangladesh with the 25-75 split. So I wanted to come out and tell you this. I want to end with one last thing that I said in the last video, is that with power comes great responsibility. And if you cannot be responsible, if you cannot take responsibility for your actions, if you cannot say, I made a mistake, we're going to find ways to fix this. This was a big problem. We're going to find ways to fix this. If you don't have the humility to be responsible, then you shouldn't be in that position of power. The world would be a better place today if people understood this, and if we understood this when we lift people up to positions of power, of whether they will be responsible stewards of the responsibility that is bestowed upon them by way of the power that comes to them through the people of the United States in this situation. With that said, I've talked long enough, longer than I would have liked to, but I hope you stick around. If you have, thank you so much for listening. Please come back and please subscribe, and I'll talk to you soon.